Hi, I'm Chad with Move for Guitar. This lesson is from our series, How to Read Music for Guitar. In this lesson, I'm going to explain dots in music notation. First off, if you like all the diagrams for this series, including the diagrams for this lesson, you can download our free e-guide, How to Read Music for Guitar. But I am working on it right now as I'm filming this lesson, so it might not be available as you're watching this lesson. If it is available, a link will pop up on the screen that'll allow you to download it. And like I said, it's free, so there's no reason not to download it when it is available. This is part 23 from our series, How to Read Music for Guitar. If you'd like to go back and start at the beginning, you can click the link on the screen. So far we've talked about the note values on your screen right now. We've talked about the whole note, the half note, the quarter note, the eighth note, and the 16th note. And you should be pretty good with recognizing those by now and knowing how to count them and what they all represent, especially in common time in 4/4 time. Which in 4/4 time, a whole note represents 4 beats, half 2 beats, quarter is the beat, so 1 beat, eighth half a beat, and 16th note a quarter of a beat. But there's actually a way to extend these notes. So you could take any of these notes and use what's called a dot. So this is drawn really big right now, but that's a dot. And what a dot does is it adds another half to the note value. And what that means is, for example, if we had a quarter note, if you added a dot in front of it, that would be like adding a quarter note and an eighth note, because this dot is adding 1/2 the value of the quarter note, and 1/2 of a quarter note is an eighth note, because 2 eighth notes equal a quarter note. So 1 eighth note is half of a quarter note. So anytime you see a dot on the right hand side of a note, you're adding 1/2 the value to the note again. So you have the value of the note, but then you have half of that note added into it. And since this is a quarter note, you'd have a quarter note plus an eighth note. And that's how long you would hold this note out. And that would be called a dotted quarter note. So anytime you see a dot next to a note, that's called a dotted whatever note. So a dotted half note, a dotted eighth note, whatever. So a dotted half note would be a half note plus a quarter note, because a quarter note is half the value of a half note. So you're adding that half value into there. So this dotted half note would be held out for this amount of time. A dotted quarter note we already went over. A dotted eighth note is an eighth note plus a 16th note, because a 16th note is half the value of an eighth note. A dotted 16th note, which that dot's kind of hard to see with the 16th note, is a 16th note plus a 32nd note. And we haven't gone over a 32nd note, but a 32nd note is half the value of a 16th note. So there's 32 32nd notes in a whole note. It just is adding on to that value tree that we went over before. And you can tell a 16th note from a 32nd note because it has that extra flag. Just like you can tell a 16th note from an eighth note because an eighth note has 1 flag, 16th note has 2 flags, a 32nd note has 3 flags. And you can also add dots to rest. So you can add them to a rest and it's going to add the same value that it does for the notes. What would be a quarter note rest, then with the dot it'd be like adding an eighth note rest to it, and so on. If you run across a double dot, that means, for example, with this quarter note, you would have the quarter note plus the eighth note, because that's what the one dot represented, like I just showed. But then the next dot is adding half the value of this note, so you add a 16th note onto it. So a double dotted quarter note would be like a quarter note plus an eighth note plus a 16th note. So that next dot you're adding onto it is adding half of the value of this note right here. That was added from the first dot. So it's like adding quarter of the value of the original note. So this is half, this is adding another quarter right here with that second dot. You can also see dots with beams. So right here would be a dotted eighth note beamed with the 16th note. So this would represent an eighth note plus a 16th note, and then you have another 16th note there. So this whole value right here is the same as 2 eighth notes. But there will be situations where you run across the need for this. So if we took a look at this on the staff in 4/4 time, because that's what we're sticking with, to go through and figure out what's going on, you have a half note here, and a half note is usually 2 beats, but this dot adds in another beat, because in 4/4 time the quarter note is a beat. So this is like 3 quarter notes here, so you'd have 1, 2, 3 all represented here. These are your beats, and then of course you have another beat right here. So that's 4 beats there. Every one of these is going to have 4 beats because it's in 4/4 time. This dotted quarter note is obviously 1 beat for the quarter note, then you have an eighth note added on right here, then you have an eighth note rest, so both of these together equal 2 beats, and then you have a half note, which is 2 beats, so that's 4. Right here is a dotted eighth note, which equals an eighth note plus a 16th note. Then you have another 16th note here, so that's like 2 eighth notes, which equals 1 beat. You have a dotted quarter note, which the quarter note is 1 beat plus an eighth note, and then another eighth note rest here, so these together equal another beat. They equal 2 beats total. And then you have a quarter note, so that's obviously beat, so that's 4 beats. Then you have a quarter note rest. So again, that's just like a regular dotted quarter note, but it's the amount of time that you're resting, not playing a note. So that's a quarter note plus an eighth note. Here's an eighth note here. So these together equal 2 beats. Then you have 2 eighth notes, that's a beat, and then a quarter note, that's a beat. That's 4 beats, 4 quarter notes. So if you were to count that, it would be like this. You'd have 1, 2, 3 for this. Obviously, this quarter note is 4. When you count a dotted quarter note, you're usually going to want to break it up like you're counting eighth notes because you're adding this in, which is like adding an eighth note, so you need that and. So you count 1 and 2. That equals the dotted quarter note because a quarter note by itself, if you're counting as eighth notes, is 1 and. So you need to add that extra eighth note in, which would be the 2. Then you have an eighth note rest, which is obviously just an and then a half note, which is 3 and 4. Those are your next 2 beats. This dotted eighth note, you'd need to break up like 16th notes, so 1 and a 2 and a, because this dot is adding in what would be a 16th note. So you'd have 1 E for the actual eighth note, and then and for that dot, because 1 E would be an eighth note by itself if you're breaking up an eighth note into counting it by 16th notes. And then this 16th note would land on this dotted quarter would land on the next beat 2, so that would be 2 and 3 for the dotted quarter note. Then you're just on an eighth note rest, which is and. Here's 4 for that beat, which is quarter note. Quarter note rest, so you're not playing here, but you're counting it, would be 1 and 2. That would be this right here. This note is an eighth note, you're landing on and then these 2 eighth notes are just 3 and then you're on a quarter note that lands on 4. So that would be how you actually count this out with these dotted notes. And if you really want to dive into rhythms, I'm going to do a whole series about rhythms and counting them out, but I'm just giving you the basics in this series so that when you come across them, you know how to count them out. But for actually getting it down and practicing it, you really need to practice it and go over and check out different rhythms and stuff, which I'll do in that other series. And one thing I need to point out, because it can be really confusing if you haven't seen it before, is if you see a dot at the bottom or the top of a note, which are right there and right there, instead of the side like these other notes have, that is not a dotted note. That is actually something called staccato, which means that you play the note really quickly. You just play it and release really quickly, which I'll have a lesson about staccato. But just know for now that when you see a dotted note that's adding to the value of the time, it's going to be on the right hand side. If you see one below or above, that is something different. These mean totally different things, so don't let that confuse you. And like I said, I'll have a lesson that really goes into what those mean. So that's an explanation of dots or dotted notes in music notation. Go ahead and move on to the next lesson where I'm going to talk about ties. And be sure to download the e-guide. All the diagrams are in there. And be sure to subscribe because we had at least one new lesson every day.